What do you make of this report that the Iranian regime is essentially telling their proxies to sit on ice, don't attack, don't provoke, lay low? What do you make of that?
Well, it's consistent. It's consistent with patterns of Iranian national security behavior in the past. And it's consistent with a theory I have as to how Iran's supreme leader and commander in chief is trying to set the chessboard for the short term future. And that is, there's a Trump trap being set right now in Tehran. The Islamic Republic is looking to not just take advantage of President Trump's instinct and desire for a deal, but to really use negotiations as a shield against increasing Israeli military action, both against it as well as its proxies in the region. It's also looking to buy time to prevent transatlantic coordination between Europe and America on a whole host of issues like counter missile, counter drone, counter human rights, a whole host of things that Europe and America have been increasingly good on together in the multilateral space. It's also to that end trying to use negotiations to prevent major diplomatic pressure at the UN. There's this thing called snapback, where there's the restoration of UN sanctions. The last opportunity to have this happen is October 18, 2025. So it's trying very hard to put on a nice face and avoid that deadline as well. And then naturally on the economic front, the regime is bankrupt, the regime is broke. It's afraid of a return of max pressure 2.0, and it's trying to sweeten the equation for the president by trying to turn off the fire. And indeed, if you look at Iran-backed militias in a place like Iraq, for example, they have not struck U.S. positions in Iraq or Syria really since the election period or shortly thereafter. And this, too, I think, is a signal, but one I think that the new administration should see as a signal of weakness rather than a signal of goodwill and good faith.
Yeah, I was going to ask you that. I mean, because it's you could kind of look at this from both sides. You could say, okay, well, what you're implying is that the Iranian regime is significantly weakened, and they're looking just to maintain a hold on power to survive, and so they're doing what they need to in order to try to save themselves. Or, it almost seems also that you're implying that it's a very strategic plan on their part, very thought out plan, and that they're basically just buying time with the idea that I would imagine that they're looking to rebuild their proxies and claw back some of the problems that they've experienced.
I think that's exactly right. What you just laid out is a combination of tactical and strategical, what this regime is doing in the short term and the logic with which it's doing it and the eye to which it's doing it for the long term. I mean, just look at what the regime was doing in late December and early January before President-elect Trump became President Trump, so basically before inauguration. There was a surge in attempts to sell Iranian oil, including Iranian oil that was held in storage in borders and in ports in places like China, for example, so that they could get more revenue, so that they could, again, brace themselves for maximum pressure. And then, of course, there is not my word, but the Director General of the International Atomic Energy Agency, who was talking about the regime hitting the gas pedal, I think was the phrase, in terms of uranium enrichment and the speed at which it was enriching to 60% purity. And just for the audience to know, uranium is the fissile material you need for a nuclear weapon, but a country that can enrich to 60% is basically 90+% of the way to 90% purity. And 90% purity is pure weapons grade uranium. That's like the perfect material that you would need for that core of a nuclear weapon. And because enrichment with uranium is logarithmic, it's not linear. If you go 60%, you're basically 90%.
Yeah, that 60 to 90 is again, not to oversimplify, is sort of the easier lift. It's getting to the 60% that takes the time, the effort, the work. Give us your perspective, if you could. How weak are they? We talk about, okay, they're obviously the Hamas, Hezbollah, even the Houthis at this point have been degraded by Israeli actions for the most part. But looking at the Iranian regime, how weak are they?
Well, there's a couple different measures. There's the fact that this regime has had energy crises, currency crises, even on the backdrop of the outgoing Biden administration's lax sanctions enforcement. So certainly there's the political effects of the loss of its sole state ally in the Middle East, the Assad regime in Syria. There's the gutting of two of the major proxies that the regime has armed, trained, and equipped to Israel's north and south. That's Hezbollah in Lebanon, and that's Hamas in Gaza, that the Israelis have militarily beaten back. There's basically the long-range air defenses that the Iranians had received from the Russians. That's the S-300 that the Israelis had significantly damaged or destroyed in their October response to Iran's October ballistic missile barrage. And by the way, that is the largest single-day ballistic missile barrage in history. And even though the Iranians landed some 30 to 32 to 35 missiles, depending on how you count, it was largely believed to be a successful interception by the Israelis in the interconnected system of air and missile defense in the Middle East that the U.S. has worked to support. But again, you don't have to take my word for it. Just take a look at the Persian press in the past week, week and a half, and it's all been a case of the lady doth protest too much. You have major Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps officials feeling the need to come out and say, we are not weak. You know, that traditionally tends to happen when you actually are weak. You have hardline media organizations in the Islamic Republic that have been championing the axis of resistance war against Israel over the past year and a half, since the war broke out on October 7, 2023 in the Middle East with Hamas's attack against Israel. And they are running headlines like, the war which we won, which empirically and objectively you cannot say for the Islamic Republic went their way. So because of all of this, the Islamic Republic is looking to use the prospect of negotiations to prevent an attack, to rebuild at home, to stabilize at home, and then tomorrow make sure it's in the position to export that ideology and export those arms and weapons and money again abroad.